I was standing on the cedar deck of a rented cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was 7:15 on a crisp October morning. I was holding a warm cup of coffee. I should have been relaxed, but I was just feeling that familiar Sunday dread creeping into my chest. The weekend was almost over. I had to go back to the fluorescent lights and the endless project meetings tomorrow. Then I looked over at the property next door. There was a fresh wooden sign hammered into the front yard. For sale. The asking price was $450,000. I was 42 years old. I was working 50 hours a week. I was making $160,000 a year as a software engineering manager. I looked at that house and I told myself I had earned it. I told myself I had finally made enough money to buy my own permanent slice of peace. I could picture my family spending every Thanksgiving sitting around that stone fireplace. What I did not know at the time was that this beautiful wooden cabin was not an escape hatch. It was a financial bear trap painted to look like a dream. When I finally sat down and did the forensic accounting on my own life, I realized this exact dream would silently drain over $34,000 a year in unrecoverable costs from my net worth. My name is Mark, and I spend way too much time obsessing over the hidden math of the second home dream. If you are someone who works hard and daydreams about buying a weekend getaway to escape the daily burnout, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Because today, I am not talking about how to negotiate the best interest rate or how to decorate a rustic living room. I want to talk about the brutal mathematical reality of vacation home ownership that the real estate industry actively hides from you. And I know it because I have been exactly where you are standing right now. I wanted that house desperately. I wanted the status of it. I wanted the feeling of arriving on a Friday night and turning my key in my own door. I viewed it as the ultimate proof that I had succeeded in my career. I thought I was being incredibly smart about it too. I ran the basic numbers in my head right there on the deck. I knew I had $90,000 sitting in a high-yield savings account. I knew I could easily cover a 20% down payment. I figured the monthly mortgage would just replace what I was already spending on expensive short-term rentals a few times a year. I told myself it was an asset. I told myself I was building generational wealth while creating priceless memories for my family. Real estate always goes up. That is what everyone says. That is what I believed, but that is the trap. The vacation home fantasy relies on us doing only the first layer of the math. We calculate the down payment. We calculate the monthly principal and interest. And then we stop. We stop right where the real estate broker wants us to stop. We never calculate the invisible bleed. We never calculate the massive opportunity cost. We never calculate the true price of holding a depreciating physical structure in a volatile climate zone while trying to manage it from 3 hours away. I want to break down exactly what happens when you sign a 30-year contract for a house you only sleep in 4 weeks a year. I am going to show you the exact spreadsheet that forced me to walk away from the property next door, because the truth is deeply uncomfortable. The real cost of a vacation home is not the purchase price. The real cost is what happens to your net worth when the house sits empty. And the bleeding starts the moment you get the keys. I did not have a name for it back then. I was just a guy looking at a cabin and trying to justify the math in my head. When I finally went looking for answers later, I found out this specific financial phenomenon is called the second dream trap. I did not know it had a name until I started really digging into this. The concept perfectly captures how we buy real estate not for its financial return, but for the idealized version of ourselves we think we will become once we own it. When I started reading deeper on this, I found the concept of the ownership illusion buried in behavioral economics research. Then, one night, I came across a 2014 study from the National Association of Realtors. That study completely broke my mental model. I used to think that most people who bought vacation homes held onto them for decades. I pictured properties passing peacefully down from grandparents to grandchildren. Then, I found the data in that National Association of Realtors report showing that the median time a buyer holds onto a vacation property is actually only 6 years. I read that twice. The dream of passing a mountain cabin down through the generations usually dies in less than a decade. The fantasy fades because the brutal reality of the math always catches up with the buyer. At first, I only saw the surface level of this math, and I thought I understood it. Let me walk you through exactly what my brain was calculating while I stared at that for sale sign. The asking price was $450,000. I knew I had $90,000 sitting in cash ready to go. That was exactly 20%. That meant my loan would be $360,000. Assuming a standard 30-year fixed mortgage at an interest rate of roughly 7%, I calculated my core payment. The principal and interest came out to $2,395 a month. I looked at that number and smiled. I was mentally high-fiving myself. I thought I was outsmarting the system. I thought I was making a rational investment choice disguised as a luxury purchase. I told myself that roughly $28,700 a year was basically the same price I was already paying to take my family on nice trips. Except now, instead of throwing that money away on other people's rental properties, I would be paying down my own mortgage. I was converting an expense into a hard asset. I was going to build equity while we made memories around the fire pit. It felt like a financial masterstroke. Most people know this exact feeling. You look at the base mortgage payment and you tell yourself it is completely manageable. You convince yourself that buying is always mathematically superior to renting. But here is what I spent years not understanding. That simple mortgage calculation is a mirage. The principal and interest are not the actual cost of a second home. They are just the cover charge. Because when I actually sat down and modeled out what it costs to keep a secondary physical structure standing in the elements, I realized the math was hiding something ugly. That monthly payment was just the first layer, and the second layer was about to completely blow up my budget. I sat at my kitchen table the Tuesday after that mountain trip. My laptop was open. I had a fresh spreadsheet glowing on the screen. This is the stage where the trap looks the most inviting. At first, I only saw this part, and I thought I understood it. I typed in the purchase price of $450,000. I typed in my down payment of $90,000. I stared at the remaining loan balance of $360,000. I punched in a 7% interest rate. The monthly principal and interest payment popped up. $2,395. I started rationalizing immediately. I looked at my credit card statements from the previous year. My family had spent about $12,000 on vacations. We rented a beach house for a week in July. We took a 4-day ski trip in February. We stayed in a few nice hotels for long weekends. I took that $12,000 and divided it by 12 months. That was $1,000 a month we were already spending on travel. So I told myself the new cabin was not really costing me $2,395 a month. In my head, I subtracted the $1,000 we were already spending. That left $1,395 a month in new spending. I was earning $160,000 a year. My take-home pay after taxes and retirement contributions was about $8,500 a month. I looked at that extra $1,395 and thought it was completely safe. It was just a line item, and the best part, I told myself, was that I was no longer throwing money into a furnace. When you rent a hotel room, that money is gone forever. You check out at 11 in the morning, and you have nothing to show for it but a tiny bottle of shampoo. But a mortgage is different. A mortgage is forced savings. Every time I made that $2,395 payment, I was paying down the principal. I was building equity. I was buying a piece of the earth. I genuinely believed I was making a sophisticated financial play. I was converting my family vacation budget into a hard asset. If we ever needed the money, we could just sell the cabin. Real estate always goes up. That was the mantra repeating in my head. I was so confident in my spreadsheet. I was ready to call the real estate agent and make an offer. I even picked up my phone, but then I paused. I looked at the $90,000 I was about to wire away. That money had been sitting in a high-yield savings account earning 5%. It was generating $4,500 a year in completely passive income. Zero effort, zero risk. If I bought the cabin, that $90,000 would vanish into the equity of the house. The $4,500 in passive income would disappear on day one. That single realization made me hesitate. I put my phone down. I decided to add a few more rows to my spreadsheet. I decided to calculate the actual cost of keeping a second building standing up against the weather. And that is when the clean, beautiful math of my mortgage calculator completely fell apart. I was about to discover the invisible bleed. But when I dug deeper, I found something that most people never notice. I opened a new tab on my browser. I started searching for the actual carrying costs of a mountain property. I thought I knew what it cost to run a house. I already owned one, but a second home operates on a completely different set of rules. First, I looked up the county property taxes. For a $450,000 house, the tax bill was roughly $4,500 a year. That added $375 a month to my spreadsheet. That did not feel too bad. Then I looked at utilities. Even when a house is empty, it consumes cash. You have to keep the heat on at 55 degrees all winter so the pipes do not freeze. You have to pay the base rate for water and trash collection even when the bins are empty. You have to pay for high-speed internet just so your remote security cameras stay online. I estimated an extremely conservative $300 a month. Then came the maintenance. This is where my city brain failed me. A mountain cabin faces severe weather. It faces heavy snow on the roof. It faces ice expanding in the gutters. It faces mice looking for winter shelter. The standard real estate rule is setting aside 1 to 2% of the home value every year for repairs. I went with 1.5%. That meant I needed to budget $6,750 a year just to keep the property from falling apart. That was another $562 a month. I had to pay that whether I used the house or not. My spreadsheet was getting heavier, but the real shock came when I called an insurance broker. I used to think that insuring a second home would be cheaper than my primary house. I figured since I was only there 4 weeks a year, the liability would be lower. Less usage means less risk. It made logical sense to me. Then I found a 2023 industry report from Policy Genius showing that secondary home insurance actually costs an average of 20% to 40% more than a primary residence. I read the explanation, and the logic made me sick to my stomach. When you live in a house and a pipe bursts under the kitchen sink, you hear it. You turn off the water in 5 minutes. You mop the floor. The damage is a few $100s. When a pipe bursts in a vacant cabin on a Tuesday in November, it sprays water for 3 straight weeks. By the time you show up for Thanksgiving, the entire foundation is destroyed. Insurance companies know this. They price the massive risk of an empty house into your premium. My quote came back at $2,400 a year. That was exactly $200 a month. I looked at the bottom of my spreadsheet. The clean, $2,395 mortgage had mutated. When I added the property taxes, the utilities, the maintenance, and the inflated insurance, the carrying costs added up to $1,437 every single month. My total monthly payment was no longer $2,395. It was $3,832. Over a year, that meant I was committing to spending $45,984 just to keep the building standing and the bank happy. I sat back in my chair. The math was changing fast. But I was still trying to save the dream. I told myself I could just rent it out on the weekends. I was not there. Everyone else was doing it. I could let other people pay my mortgage. But that was the exact moment the trap snapped shut. Because I had not calculated the cost of running a part-time hotel. And this is the part that took me years to figure out. The part nobody tells you. When I saw that my annual cost was going to be almost $46,000, my brain immediately switched to defense mode. I told myself I would just put the cabin on a short-term rental site. It is the classic pivot every prospective second home buyer makes to save the fantasy. I looked at comparable cabins in the area. They were renting for $350 a night. I did some quick mental math. If I could rent it out for just 100 nights a year, that would generate $35,000 in gross revenue. Suddenly, the house was almost paying for itself. I felt like a financial genius again. I used to think that running a rental property was just about listing it online and watching the money roll in. Then I found a 2023 data report from AirDNA, a short-term rental analytics company, showing that the average occupancy rate for rural mountain rentals was actually only 42%. That meant the house would sit completely empty more than half the year, but I was still clinging to my $35,000 projection. I figured I would just market it better. Then I started calling local property managers. Because I lived 3 hours away. I could not drive up the mountain on a Tuesday afternoon to plunge a toilet or fix a broken smart lock. The first company I called quoted me a management fee of 25% of gross revenue. The second company quoted me 30%. Let that sink in. If the house generated $35,000, the property manager was taking $8,750 right off the top, just for answering phone calls and coordinating cleaners. Then I found the platform fees. The booking websites take another 3 to 5%. Then I learned about local lodging taxes. The county charged a transient occupancy tax of 8%. That had to be paid out of the gross revenue too. My $35,000 dream was evaporating fast. But the final blow came when I started reading host forums. I used to think that guests would treat my beautiful mountain cabin with the same respect I would. Then I found a thread of experienced owners talking about wear and tear. They explained that short-term renters do not care about your hardwood floors. They drag snowy boots across the living room. They overload the washing machine. They leave the hot tub cover off in freezing temperatures. The standard real estate rule of 1.5% for maintenance is completely useless when you run a part-time hotel. You have to double it. At least. That meant my maintenance budget jumped from $6,750 to $13,500 a year. I rebuilt my spreadsheet. I put in the $35,000 in gross rental income. Then I subtracted the 25% management fee. I subtracted the platform fees. I subtracted the local taxes. I subtracted the massive increase in maintenance costs for the damage the guests would inevitably cause. My net rental income dropped to roughly $8,000. I stared at the screen. I was taking on all the risk of a $450,000 mortgage. I was letting strangers sleep in my beds and scratch my floors. I was managing a hospitality business from 3 hours away, and my reward was $8,000 a year, but my total carrying costs were still $45,984. Even in the absolute best-case scenario with the rental income, I was still bleeding almost $38,000 a year out of pocket, just to own a house I barely visited. And the ultimate irony hit me right in the chest. To make that rental income, I had to rent the cabin out during the peak seasons. I had to rent it for Thanksgiving. I had to rent it during the prime ski weeks, the exact weeks I wanted to use it to build memories with my family. I realized I was not buying a vacation home. I was buying a terrible second job, a job that required a $90,000 entry fee and lost $38,000 a year. I closed my laptop. I felt sick. Because the worst part was not just the money going out the door every single month. The worst part was what that money could have been doing if I had kept it. I sat there staring at the spreadsheet, and I realized I needed to zoom out. I needed to see what this decision looked like over the rest of my life. This is where the lifetime math comparison completely shattered the illusion for me. I decided to run two scenarios side by side. I wanted to see the exact difference between the path I almost took and the mathematical alternative over 10, 20, and 30 years. Path 1 was buying the cabin. Let us assume I bought the house for $450,000. I put down my $90,000. Every year, I bleed roughly $38,000 to keep it running. I deal with the renters. I pay the taxes. I replace the roof. Over 20 years, I pumped $760,000 of cash into that property, plus my original down payment. I have now sunk $850,000 into a wooden box in the woods. Now, let us be generous to the real estate market. Let us assume the cabin doubles in value over those 2 decades. It is now worth $900,000. I decide to sell it. I pay off the remaining mortgage balance. After the broker fees and the closing costs, I walk away with maybe $650,000 in cash. I put in $850,000. I got back $650,000. I lost $200,000 of my own wealth to buy myself a part-time job as a motel manager. Then I looked at path 2, the mathematical alternative. What if I just walked away from the for sale sign? I keep my $90,000 down payment. I put it into a standard index fund earning an average 8% historical return. Instead of bleeding $38,000 a year on a mortgage and maintenance, I take $12,000 of that money and rent an incredible, flawless mountain cabin for 4 weeks every single year. I show up, I enjoy the fire pit, I leave the keys on the kitchen counter, I never fix a broken heater. That leaves me with $26,000 a year in surplus cash that I would have otherwise burned on the house. I invest that $26,000 every year into the exact same index fund. I let the math run. After 10 years, my investment account grows to roughly $570,000. After 20 years, the power of compound interest takes over. The account hits $1.6 million. If I let it run for 30 years, by the time I am 72 years old, that account holds almost $3.8 million. Let us compare the two paths at the 20-year mark. That is the timeline when most people hope to retire. Path 1 left me with $650,000 in tied-up equity after 2 decades of stress. Path 2 left me with $1.6 million in liquid cash. And I still got to take my family on 20 years of perfect vacations. The gap between the two paths was staggering. The difference was roughly $1 million. At 30 years, the gap is even worse. The house might be worth $1.5 million, but I would have poured over $1.2 million into it. My net gain is tiny. Meanwhile, the index fund is sitting at $3.8 million. That single wooden sign in the yard was not an invitation to build generational wealth. It was an invitation to light millions of dollars on fire, to satisfy my own ego. The math was undeniable. It was right there on my screen. But the craziest part was how hard my brain fought against the spreadsheet. I still wanted the house. I sat at my kitchen table looking at a $1 million difference on my screen. Any rational human being would have closed the laptop and walked away immediately. But I did not. I kept the tab open. I kept staring at the photos of that stone fireplace. That was when I finally understood why I kept getting stuck even when I knew the right answer. I was fighting against a massive psychological blind spot called the ownership illusion. When I read about this concept later, it explained exactly what was happening in my brain that night. The ownership illusion is a cognitive bias, where we overvalue things simply because we feel a sense of possession over them, or in my case, a sense of future possession. I was not looking at a depreciating asset in a high-risk weather zone. I was looking at a legacy. I told myself I was buying a permanent anchor for my family. I pictured my future grandchildren running across that cedar deck. I pictured a place where my kids would always return for Thanksgiving, no matter where their careers took them. I was projecting my deepest desires for family connection onto a pile of wood and drywall. And the real estate industry knows exactly how to exploit this exact feeling. I got played by the marketing. I went back and read the actual listing description for the cabin. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The listing did not mention the 30-year age of the roof. It did not mention the average cost of snow removal in that county. It did not mention the risk of pipes freezing. Instead, the real estate agent had written about creating a sanctuary for generations. They wrote about making memories that last a lifetime. They described the fire pit as the perfect place to share stories under the stars. They were not selling me a physical structure. They were selling me emotional insurance against my kids growing up and moving away. They know that if they put the actual carrying costs in the listing, nobody would ever buy a second home. So they sell nostalgia. They sell status. They sell the illusion of permanence. I realized I was about to pay a $1 million premium just to call myself a cabin owner. That was the price tag on my ego. That was the cost of the ownership illusion. When you rent a beautiful house for a week, you get 100% of the joy and 0% of the liability. But my brain was convinced that the memories would somehow be less valuable. If my name was not on the deed, I had been conditioned to believe that renting was failing. Even when renting was mathematically superior by 7 figures, the entire system is designed to make you feel guilty for doing the smart thing. The system wants you to tie up your liquidity in their local market. The system wants you paying property management fees and inflated insurance premiums. And they keep you in the trap by telling you that you cannot put a price tag on family memories. But I just did. The price tag was over $38,000 a year in unrecoverable costs. I finally felt the spell breaking. The emotional grip of that cabin was slipping away. But my brain was stubborn. Even after I stripped away the emotional manipulation, My mind tried one last logical defense. I tried to convince myself that this was still a safe place to park my money because of the one golden rule of property ownership. Let me say out loud the objection that is forming in your head right now, because it used to form in mine. I know exactly what you are thinking right now. I know it because I was pacing around my kitchen telling myself the exact same thing. I thought about the golden rule of real estate. Real estate always goes up. I told myself that even if the cabin cost me $38,000 a year to maintain, I would make it all back when I sold it. I pictured holding the property for 10 years. I imagined the market booming. I saw myself cashing a massive check that would wipe out every dollar I ever spent on plumbers and property taxes. When someone first pointed out the flaws in this dream, my immediate reaction was to point at the housing charts. I pushed back against this idea for years. I believed a second home was essentially a high-yield savings account that you could sleep in. Then I looked at the actual historical data for vacation markets. I started comparing secondary home appreciation directly against the broader stock market. And here is the data that finally broke my defense. Yes, real estate generally appreciates, but vacation towns are incredibly volatile. They are boom and bust economies. When a recession hits, what is the very first thing people stop buying? Vacations. And what is the first asset overextended people try to sell? Their empty mountain cabins. During an economic downturn, the market in these resort towns floods with inventory. Prices plummet. It can take years to recover. But even if we assume a perfectly normal market, the math still fails. Historically, real estate appreciates at roughly 4 to 5% a year. The stock market historically returns about 8 to 10%. Let us look at what that 4% appreciation actually means in the real world. If my $450,000 cabin goes up 4% a year, it gains roughly $18,000 in paper value. But remember my spreadsheet. I was bleeding almost $38,000 a year in hard cash, just to keep the lights on and the roof intact. The math is completely upside down. You are spending $38,000 in unrecoverable costs to gain $18,000 in trapped equity. You are losing $20,000 a year in net wealth, and you cannot even spend that $18,000 of equity at the grocery store. It is locked inside the walls of the house until you sell it. And when you finally do sell it, the real estate agents and the government take their massive cut of whatever profit is left. This brings us to the counterintuitive truth that separates real wealth building from standard middle-class financial advice. Your primary residence might be an investment, but a second home is not an investment. A second home is a depreciating lifestyle asset bolted to a piece of moderately appreciating dirt, and the dirt almost never appreciates fast enough to pay for the rotting wood on top of it. Once I finally accepted that buying a second home was just buying a massive luxury good, the guilt disappeared. I stopped trying to force a bad investment to make sense. I realized I did not want a second mortgage. I just wanted a really good vacation. So I closed the real estate tab forever, and I built a completely new system to give my family the exact memories I wanted without the financial trap. The first thing I did was change where my money lived. It was a heavy realization to admit that my dream was mathematically terrible, but the relief I felt when I finally let it go was incredible. I was suddenly free to make logical choices. I no longer had to justify throwing away my hard-earned cash to support a bad investment. The first thing I did was completely separate my vacation budget from my long-term investment portfolio. I took that $90,000 I had saved for the cabin down payment. I opened my brokerage app on my phone. I moved the cash out of my savings account and put it directly into a broad market index fund. I bought shares of companies that generate actual profits. I told myself this money was no longer allowed to be touched for real estate. It was officially working for my retirement. It was going to generate compound interest instead of generating repair bills for a roof I barely lived under. The second step I took was creating a dedicated, guilt-free renting fund. Remember that almost $38,000 a year I was going to bleed on the cabin mortgage, the insurance, and the carrying costs. I decided to take exactly half of that amount. That left me with $19,000 a year. I logged into my bank. I set up an automatic transfer every single month. $1,583 moved straight from my main checking account into a separate high-yield savings bucket. I named the account the Ultimate Vacation Fund. It felt incredibly empowering to see that number grow. I now had $19,000 a year explicitly dedicated to renting other people's beautiful second homes. And I took the remaining $19,000 I would have spent on the cabin trap and added it to my index fund investments. I was literally paying myself the maintenance costs. That first year, the results of this new system were staggering. My $90,000 investment grew by roughly $7,200 just from average market returns. My extra $19,000 in monthly contributions bought me more shares every single month. My net worth was accelerating rapidly instead of draining slowly into a wooden structure in the woods. I was building actual wealth, not the illusion of wealth. When November rolled around, a massive winter storm hit the mountains. If I had bought that cabin, I would have been sick with anxiety. I would have been calling neighbors to check my property. But sitting in my city house, I felt nothing but peace. I did not have to worry about a tree falling on my roof. I did not have to answer texts from angry renters complaining about a broken heater. I did not have to write a massive check for county property taxes at the end of the year. I had my weekends back. I had my mental energy back. And I had a pile of cash growing quietly in the background. But the real magic happened when it was time to actually take my family on our first mountain trip. Because the third step was learning how to spend that vacation fund without an ounce of regret. I had $19,000 of cash ready to burn, and I was about to use it to completely hack the real estate industry from the outside. I was turning their massive financial liability into my own personal luxury service. The third thing I changed was how I actually booked our family trips. I took that $19,000 annual renting fund and I went shopping for experiences. I opened a short-term rental app. I filtered for the absolute best properties on the mountain. I did not look at the budget options. I looked at the places that cost roughly $4,500 a week. These were houses I could never actually afford to buy. I booked a stunning modern cabin for 7 days over Thanksgiving. It had a heated driveway. It had a massive stone fireplace. It was significantly nicer than the $450,000 house I almost bought. We drove up. We unpacked our groceries. We made the exact memories I had been daydreaming about on that cedar deck a year earlier. But here is the profound difference. On Sunday morning, we packed our bags. I locked the front door. I walked to my car and I drove away. I did not think about the plumbing. I did not wonder if the roof would hold up to the December snowstorms. I left 100% of the financial liability behind that locked door. Let the owner worry about the property taxes. Let the owner worry about the cleaning crew. I just bought the memory. And the best part was that I still had $14,500 left in my vacation fund for the rest of the year. We took a ski trip in February. We took a beach house for a week in July. We never stayed in the same place twice. My family got to explore the world instead of being geographically chained to one single zip code. When you run the lifetime math on this system, it feels like a cheat code for capitalism. Over 20 years, I get 20 years of flawless luxury vacations. I never plunge a toilet on my day off. And my unspent $90,000 down payment, combined with the $19,000 a year I am investing instead of burning on carrying costs, grows into a multi-million-dollar liquid portfolio. The system works perfectly because it separates the emotional desire from the financial vehicle. This is the core emotional truth underneath this entire trap. You do not actually want a second home. You want a second life. You want an escape from the corporate grind. You want uninterrupted time with the people you love. But a mortgage contract cannot guarantee those things. A deed to a piece of dirt does not manufacture happiness. And a $38,000 annual carrying cost definitely does not buy you peace. In fact, it steals your peace. The memories are not stored in the drywall. They are stored in the time you spend together. By renting guilt-free, you are buying your time back. You are keeping your wealth liquid. You are refusing to subsidize the real estate industry with your own exhaustion. If this video helped you see your finances differently, I want you to hit that like button and subscribe. Every video I make is something I wish someone had told me years earlier. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.